People moved a bald cypress weighing 4 to 5 metric tons across at least 180 kilometers of river country. They did it without draft animals or a practical wheeled system for hauling freight across that landscape. Then they raised it in Greater Cahokia. Tree ring radiocarbon analysis points most strongly to 1124, though several nearby years remain possible. People cut that tree far from the place that needed it. The original post may have stood at least 18 meters tall. Chemical signatures in the wood point to its distant source. What crossed Mississippi country was not just a tree, but a chain of canoes, ropes, tools, skilled crews, and human decisions. That tree is our first clue. Across the floodplain from present-day St. Louis, native people had created the largest known urban center north of Mexico in its time. Crowded neighborhoods, immense plazas, timber monuments, and roughly 120 mounds that once stood across the principal site. Population estimates vary, but at its peak, the central settlement may have housed 10 to 20,000 people. Then the Great Post ceased to rise. Neighborhoods thinned. The monumental center contracted. By the 14th century, the metropolis had largely emptied. Cahokia was not Atlantis, and its people did not vanish. Its deeper mystery is not who could have built it, but what made thousands choose this place, coordinate their labor, and invest in a common future. What promise could move a 5-ton tree and raise a mountain of earth? And why did that promise stop holding? Cahokia is not the city's original name. We do not know what its builders called it, or what language, perhaps what languages, filled its plazas. That gap was once filled with a racist fiction, a vanished, non-native race of mound builders invented by settlers who refused to credit indigenous Americans with monumental architecture. The evidence is clear. Native people built Cahokia. It needs no borrowed civilization. Before about the year 1050, people across the American bottom, the broad and fertile Mississippi floodplain, generally lived in dispersed farming communities. They grew maize and other crops, hunted, fished, gathered wild foods, and traveled waterways that already linked distant homelands. Busy lives, but not yet a city. Then the pattern broke. Settlements were reorganized or left behind. New houses rose in planned neighborhoods. Plazas were cleared and leveled. Mounds, courtyards, causeways, and timber monuments aligned people with a new center. Archaeologists call this rapid transformation the Cahokian Big Bang. The phrase is modern. The speed of change was real. In only a few decades, the central population may have climbed from a few thousand to between 10 and 20,000. Greater Cahokia spread across major precincts on both sides of the Mississippi and drew in a still larger regional population. This was a wager that life among thousands could offer something no scattered settlement could offer alone. Harvests fed gatherings. Smoke rose from cooking fires as newcomers entered cleared plazas. Food created obligations. Ceremony created allies, and shared work made the city's order visible for miles. Many residents were newcomers. Strontium signatures in teeth show that roughly 1/3 of the individuals in one archaeological sample had grown up beyond the local geological zone, with evidence pointing to several regions of origin. That sample was not a census, but it confirms something essential. Cahokia was built through migration as well as local growth. Imagine arriving by canoe or footpath. Smoke, voices, earth rising above the plain. The city may have offered work, belonging, protection, sacred purpose, or several at once. Its first promise was enormous. Come here, and together we can make a world larger than any one community. But how do you prove that the journey was worth it? At Cahokia, people gave the answer the shape of a mountain. At dawn, smoke would have risen from thousands of houses, paths filled with people carrying water, wood, fish, maize, clay, stone, and news. Above them stood the monument now called Monk's Mound, named after Trappist monks who lived nearby centuries later. The modern name is quiet. The ancient structure was not. Monk's Mound rises about 30 meters in 4 terraces and covers more than 5 hectares. Its footprint, not its height, is comparable to the base of the Great Pyramid at Giza. The resemblance ends there. This was not a stone pyramid. It was an immense earthen construction, built and enlarged in repeated stages through knowledge, planning, tools, and organized labor. Picture the work at human scale. Soil is cut, earth fills a basket. A carrier follows a familiar path, climbs, empties the load, and returns. Another follows, then another. The action is small. Its repetition is monumental. No worker carries a mountain. Thousands of journeys do. Earth was not one uniform material. Different soils and clays behave differently under weight and water. Selecting, placing, and packing them required judgment. The mound was not brute force made large. It was expertise coordinated. South of it lay the Grand Plaza, a vast expanse made level through extensive filling and reshaping. Its emptiness was part of the design. Houses make room for families. A plaza makes room for a public. When thousands gathered there, the city could see itself as one body. Around it stood mounds, workshops, courtyards, storage pits, residential compounds, and pole and thatch houses. High on Monk's Mound, a large timber building placed authority above the crowd. Architecture directed attention. Climb here, enter there, look upward, gather below. The city was never finished. Houses were rebuilt, mounds expanded, and public spaces changed. At the Mitchell precinct of Greater Cahokia, 10 kilometers north of the central site, the giant cypress was set into a pit about 4 meters deep. We do not know exactly how it traveled or what people said when it rose. What survives is enough. They selected a distant tree, moved several tons through a river world, and stood it against the sky. The post made distance visible. The mound made labor visible. The plaza turned strangers into a crowd. But a crowd is not yet a community. For Cahokia's promise to hold, people had to feel it together. On gathering days, the Grand Plaza could become ceremonial field, arena, meeting place, and demonstration of power. Cahokia's ideas moved through bodies, through work, food, games, and the shared experience of watching. One of the sharpest scenes was the game now called chunkey, a polished stone disc rolls. Players cast long spears toward the place they believe it will stop. Rules varied across time and region. The drama remains easy to understand. Speed, judgment, risk, dust, and a crowd reading the same uncertain path. For a moment, the entire crowd follows one moving stone. West of Monk's Mound stood a succession of large timber circles, now known as Woodhenge. They were not copies of Stonehenge, and their full meaning is beyond recovery. But solar alignments are supported. From near the center of a circle, selected posts marked important positions of the rising sun, including at the solstices. Before dawn, the timbers are dark against the east. People wait. Then the edge of the sun appears in relation to a chosen post. No imaginary clock is needed. Light gives the community a shared measure of season, renewal, and time. At night, hearths scattered through the neighborhoods, mounds turned to silhouette, and the Milky Way stretched over monuments linking earth, horizon, and sky. Food made gatherings possible. Maize production intensified, while fish, deer, waterfowl, and wild plants remained important. Feasts could turn surplus into obligation, generosity into authority, and visitors into allies. Yet unity did not mean equality. The institutions that created belonging could also rank people, command labor, and take lives. Mound 72 contained at least 270 individuals, including principal burials associated with roughly 20,000 marine shell beads and group burials interpreted as evidence of ritual killing. Their sequence, purpose, and identities remain debated. This deserves restraint, not spectacle. Even the most famous interpretation changed. The old image of a single male birdman ruler laid upon a beaded design was revised after reanalysis identified male-female pairings, numerous women, and at least one child. Power, death, and ceremony here were complex and are still being read carefully. Cahokia's power was collective. It was not necessarily equal. So what pulled people toward a center that could offer so much and demand so much? The answer begins with the roads. At Cahokia, the roads were rivers. Cahokia stood beside one of the world's great transport systems. The Mississippi and its tributaries joined the interior of a continent. Paddles struck dark water as canoes moved people, food, news, and valued materials along routes older than the city itself. Water was the highway. Marine shell came from the Gulf Coast. Copper moved through northern networks. Stone, pottery, tools, images, and ceremonial practices reveal connections across hundreds of kilometers. Imagine a canoe riding low with shell, copper dull inside a wrapped bundle, and unfamiliar voices entering the plaza. Distance arrived in forms people could touch. It is tempting to turn every connection into a border and call Cahokia an empire. The evidence does not support that certainty. No surviving map shows conquered territory. No record proves a permanent bureaucracy directing formal tribute. Influence may have traveled with migrants and marriages, pilgrims and traders. Communities could adopt Cahokian forms for purposes of their own. That is not a weaker kind of power. It is power carried through relationships. Shell became beads. Copper flashed on objects charged with meaning. A vessel's shape or an image's design could move from one community to another, changing as it went. Cahokia drew relationships inward, while Cahokian ideas moved outward. Visitors may have brought food, hides, feathers, pottery, shell, and stories. We should not imagine a permanent modern market without evidence. But thousands had to arrive, eat, sleep, and depart. A migrant city had to keep routes open for trust as well as goods. Open routes made Cahokia possible. Then the central landscape answered openness with a new form, a massive timber palisade built and rebuilt around the core. Defense is one possible purpose, but there is no proof of a final invading army. The wall may also have controlled access, separated sacred or political space, displayed authority, or answered several pressures at once. Its exact meaning is uncertain. Its contrast is not. The early city's grandest gesture was an open plaza that gathered people. The later city also invested enormous labor in a boundary. Earth was durable. Relationships were not. The breaking of those relationships did not happen in a single night. There was no final fire, named conqueror, or one disaster that emptied every house. Decline came unevenly across generations. At least three kinds of pressure may have converged: environmental instability, weakening networks, and the growing social cost of sustaining the center. They did not strike at once or weigh equally everywhere. First, water conditions changed. Sediment cores show changing patterns of Mississippi flooding during Cahokia's rise and later contraction, while other records preserve evidence of severe regional drought. Extremes of water mattered, but geoarchaeology found little support for the old morality play that Cahokians cut every tree and destroyed themselves. Climate records alone do not prove crop failure or famine. Weather was pressure, not a verdict. Second, the networks weakened. By the later 12th century, nearby ceremonial centers were contracting. Some distant materials circulated differently. Public spaces and mound construction were reorganized. Around 1200, oversized marker posts no longer seemed to have risen in Greater Cahokia. Population fell unevenly, while daily life continued in altered forms. The city did not switch off. It lost the force that once made people rearrange their lives around it. Third, the social cost of the center may have grown. Monumental labor, hierarchy, boundaries, and obligations still depended on households willing to feed the city. Floods do not build palisades. Droughts do not decide who carries the cost. Environmental shocks become crises through politics, inequality, and broken cooperation. No single pressure emptied Cahokia. Together they could change the decision thousands had once made: to come, stay, and invest. People could leave. Perhaps families found new centers, alliances, or old homelands more compelling. Perhaps hierarchy made collective demands harder to accept. The evidence cannot rank these motives. It does show that people reorganized their lives elsewhere. Neighborhoods thinned, regional influence contracted. By the 14th century, Cahokia was no longer a great metropolis, and by around 1400, intensive urban occupation had largely ended. But the abandonment of the city was not the disappearance of its people. Mississippian communities continued across a vast region, building towns, mounds, alliances, and new histories. Cahokia's population had been diverse, its language remains unknown, and the city cannot be assigned neatly to one present-day nation. Multiple native nations regard Cahokia and the wider Mississippian past as important to their heritage. The giant post now gives the story its measure. Near the city's height, the network held, people selected the tree, moved it, raised it. If it stood for 1 or 2 generations, ground-level rot could have weakened it. The surviving base appears to have broken during extraction, as nearby centers were already contracting. The post came down. The routes remained, but their destinations changed. Cahokia rose quickly as people came. Its urban life ebbed as fewer people arrived. More people built futures elsewhere, and the common future embodied by the mounds lost its former hold. Today, highways, fields, suburbs, and the St. Louis skyline surround what remains. Monk's Mound still rises over the floodplain. The Grand Plaza lies open beneath it. The houses, fires, painted surfaces, crowds, and standing posts are gone. That absence can deceive us. Grass makes architecture look natural. Silence makes a metropolis feel small. So look again. The mound is load after load carried and packed. The plaza is ground remade so people from many places could assemble and see themselves. Timbers once framed the rising sun. A chunky stone turned uncertainty into public drama. Shell and copper arrived through continental relationships, and far from the center, a bald cypress was chosen. People cut it, moved it into Greater Cahokia, and stood it upright. Its journey was a chain of agreement. It made the promise visible while the promise held. What was that promise? That strangers could become a public, and that shared labor and ceremony could bind generations. For a time it did. Then conditions and relationships changed. Some remained as the city contracted. Others carried knowledge, kinship, and memory elsewhere. Leaving did not erase the achievement. It was another form of agency. Cahokia was not a failed version of somebody else's city. It was one of the great indigenous urban experiments of North America. Its power came from people, and that was also its limit. Earthworks can endure for centuries. Authority lasts only while people continue to invest it with food, labor, belief, and attention. The mound is a decision. The plaza is a decision. The great tree, brought across 180 kilometers of river country, is a decision. And so is the road away.